To me, Albert Fish was the weirdest serial killer of them all. He'd embed needles into his groin and abdomen. He also enjoyed repeatedly hitting himself with a piece of wood with nails protruding from the end of it. Another painful practice he found pleasurable was inserting wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus. And he often prepared himself a dinner consisting only of raw meat, feeding this to himself as well as to his children, believing there was a purpose behind doing that. Incredibly, Albert was assessed by a number of psychiatrists due to his bizarre behaviours, and these evaluations took place before he committed his first murder. Yet each psychiatrist found him sane. I don't know about you, but like myself, many people are drawn to the violence created by serial killers, probably because we can't comprehend their actions but feel compelled to at least try to understand. I think our fascination with serial killers is partly based on that need, on the need to understand. And let me know if you agree or disagree with this down in the comments below. The question is, what motivated people like Albert Fish to do horrendous things to their fellow humans? We're talking about people just going about their daily business, not knowing that at any moment their lives will be snuffed out by some kind of deranged, twisted and psychopathic killer who's lurking in the dark. I'm Royston and I'm back with your weekly dose of true crime. It's great having you join me, and I'd like to thank you for stopping by. If you're intrigued by true crime or serial killers, then you're in the right place. The weirdest of these, as already mentioned in my opinion, was Albert Fish, and he's a guy we're going to deep dive into in today's video. Albert was born in Washington, D.C. on the 19th of May, 1870. His father was 43 years older than his mother and turned 75 at the time of Albert's birth. However, 5 years after Albert entered the world, his father suffered a heart attack and died. As a result of that, his mother sent him to St. John's Orphanage, where he was unfortunately indecently assaulted on a regular basis. In time though, he found the physical pain he endured actually turned him on, as the beatings in a very weird way brought a measure of satisfaction to him. Albert once said something to the effect that he was in that place until around the age of 9, and that's where his life took a turn for the worse. He witnessed other boys first-hand being beat up, while being beat up himself. Maybe the conditions he faced in that orphanage shaped his warped thinking faculties that affected him for the rest of his life. A few years later, in 1880, his mother got a job that afforded her the opportunity to bring young Albert back home. It was too little too late by then, if you know what I mean. The mistreatment inflicted on him left its mark both physically and mentally. And at the age of 12, another young boy introduced him to some disgusting practices, including eating feces and drinking urine. Whether that extended to consuming other people's waste, I really don't know. Additionally, he started using public baths with the goal of spying on his fellow peers as they undressed, spending a large proportion of his weekends doing that as a peeping Tom. It was an activity he found exciting, and by 1890, at the age of 20, he arrived in New York City, and at this point he started selling his body for sex and began molesting young boys. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage for him with a woman named Anna Mary Hoffman, who he fathered 6 children with. Throughout 1898, Fish worked as a house painter, admitting that he continued violating children even after his marriage. His victims were mainly young boys below the age of 6. On one occasion, he was taken to a waxworks museum by a male partner or a lover, where he was instantly fascinated by the bisection of the male genitalia, and after that, he became obsessed with mutilation. In 1910, while Fish was working in Wilmington, Delaware, aged 39 or 40, he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas, who he took wherever he was staying. They engaged in a sadomasochistic relationship, although it's unclear whether Fish forced him to do this. But in his confession, he implied that the 19-year-old was intellectually disabled. And after 10 days of that engagement, he took Thomas to an old farmhouse, where he decided to torture him over a 2-week period. He tied the teenager up and was compelled to cut half of his penis off. Albert said he'd never forget the young man's ear-piercing screams or the look he gave after what he experienced. The original plan Albert had in mind was to kill Thomas, cut his body up and take it home. However, guess what stopped him from doing that? You might be thinking it was common sense or a repulsion for even thinking about doing that kind of thing. Well, the reason he provided for not doing it was the weather. He was concerned that the hot weather at the time would draw attention to him, so instead Fish poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill for Thomas before kissing him goodbye, and abandoned him. And after that, he took the first train back home, effectively erasing the event from his mind. A few years later, and by January of 1917, after an astonishing 19 years of marriage, his wife left him for another man, leaving him to care for their children as a single parent. It was around the time that this weird man began to indulge in self-harm as a masochist. He'd embed needles into his groin and abdomen. In fact, 29 needles were lodged into his pelvic region, as discovered through x-rays taken after his eventual arrest. He also hit himself repeatedly, using a piece of wood with nails protruding from the end of it. Another painful practice he enjoyed was inserting wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and setting it on fire. Although he was in charge of his children's upbringing, there's no record that he actually ever physically attacked or exploited them in any way. Well, kind of, as he did encourage them or their friends to whack him in the rear using that piece of wood containing the nails. He also developed an obsession with cannibalism, often preparing meals consisting purely of raw meat. And he ate it not just for himself, but he even felt the need to feed this raw meat to his children at times. His reasoning was it would help to minimize his desire or temptation to actually eat someone for real. I think it's true to say that his life truly took a dark turn, especially after his wife left him. However, he was assessed by a number of psychiatrists due to his bizarre behaviours, and the evaluations took place before he committed his first murder. Apparently, each assessment resulted in him being observed as a disturbed individual, but he was declared sane, and as a consequence to that, he was discharged back into the community. Disturbingly, when back within the community, he started to collect a variety of torture devices, like a meat cleaver, a handsaw, and a butcher's knife, as he had a lot going on in that psychopathic mind of his. But the problem was, once he started to kill, which began roughly in 1924, he found it impossible to stop. However, he was arrested sometime after murdering a 10-year-old girl in an empty cottage in Westchester, New York, and that murder took place in the summer of 1928. The girl was named Grace Budd, and by some time, well over 6 years after the event. And not only did he murder her, which was confirmed by the fact that her skull and other parts of her skeleton were found behind the cottage Albert identified as a place she died in, but he also ate her body over a 9-day period, fulfilling his cannibalistic desires. But that detail wasn't confirmed by the authorities. You can see via these photographs the detailed search the police made surrounding the cottage Albert pointed out during his confession. He was 58 when he murdered Grace in 1928 and 64 years old when apprehended for the crime in 1934. And that was because he sent a letter to the Budd family 6 years after murdering the 10-year-old. Police were able to trace the origin of the letter, leading them to Mr. Fish. He explained in his letter how Grace had fought for her life, kicking, biting and scratching before being choked to death. He went on to describe in great detail exactly what he did to her to make sure the Budd family understood the horrors Grace was subjected to. He was clearly a sadist who derived tremendous pleasure knowing that this letter caused emotional discomfort as well as deep psychological pain to Grace's family. There are different types of serial killers, and Albert was more of an organised one. He learned to use his charm, combined with his elderly, fragile appearance, to get people, both adults and children, to trust him, indicating his skill at manipulation. See, Mr. Fish hid behind a number of aliases to camouflage his real identity, and he also planned his murders often in advance. He selected the house where he murdered Grace ahead of time. Albert murdered at least 3 young people, but confessed to well over 100 killings between 1924 and 1932. The time frame's questionable, to be fair, as it could have been a much wider period. However, in the main, his victims were carefully selected youngsters who wouldn't primarily be missed, as he was an organised monster. He'd lure them into a secluded area like he did with Grace, where he could torture, sexually assault, murder, dismember by using his kill kit, the meat cleaver, handsaw and a butcher's knife, and finally he'd eat their bodies until he was sexually satisfied, as it all related to his sadistic desires, the inner need he had to inflict excruciating pain. He murdered children in such grotesque ways that I don't feel inclined to provide the full details, although I've left a link to the resources referring to them in the description box. However, it was Grace Budd's demise that led to his capture, sentencing and execution. And he was executed on the 16th of January 1936 by the electric chair at Sing Sing prison when he was 65 years old. And just prior to his death, this serial killer, who was abnormal in so many ways, asked the executioner if he could help position the electrodes on his body in preparation for death. I mean, this was a thrilling event for him as a masochist. He loved the feeling of pain. He even said,
"What a thrill that will be if I have to die in the electric chair."
Even though he confessed to murdering over 100 people with only 3 of them confirmed, nonetheless it's perplexing to learn that his last words were, "I don't even know why I'm here." Could he have been suffering with a dissociative disorder? One thing we know for certain is this. He was without question one of the most depraved serial killers known to man. He was a sadist, a paedophile, and a cannibal who inflicted unknown terror. Hi everyone, Tea and Crime would like to thank you for watching this episode. And before you go, you can help us out by leaving a like on the video, providing you enjoyed it of course. And those not yet subscribed, we'd like to encourage you to consider doing that, alongside turning the bell notification on. And it'd be nice to hear your opinion about this case in the comments down below. For those of you wanting to watch another, there's 2 on the screen right now for your attention.